My body, mind, and soul in the place of Jesus. There is one image that Jonathan Roumie will probably never be able to look at the same way again. A man hanging on a cross, exhausted, wounded, almost completely drained of strength, surrounded by soldiers and by a crew who, during those weeks, began to forget that they were standing in the middle of a film production. This was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, and it continues to affect me in ways I never imagined. I didn't expect to still feel the weight and the pain of it months later. The cameras kept rolling, the commands kept being given, but something had changed. For Roumie, portraying Jesus during the crucifixion was not simply a matter of putting on a crown of thorns, carrying a wooden crossbeam, and enduring hours of makeup and filming. When you allow that kind of merging to happen with your soul, and in this case, Jesus is the soul for me, it's as if I simply want Him to work through me. When the cameras finally stopped, part of that experience remained with Him. And perhaps that is exactly why the story behind the crucifixion in The Chosen is far more difficult to watch than anything the series itself could ever show. Every detail of the scourging, the crowning with thorns, the punches, the act of tearing the garment from a body that had already been scourged, the crucifixion, the raising of the crossbeam, and the very act of hanging there involved catastrophic pain and suffering. To understand what happened in Italy, we need to go back a few steps. Because the weight of that cross did not begin when Jonathan Roumie arrived on the Calvary set. He had already been carrying the weight of portraying Jesus for years. But the seasons depicting Holy Week would take that commitment to an entirely different level. Season 5 placed him in the middle of events, such as the Last Supper and the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. Filming the Last Supper alone required several days of intense work in an emotionally charged atmosphere that demanded an unusual degree of inward focus from Roumie. At the same time, his body was beginning to pay the price. There were weeks when the night shoots began around 5 in the afternoon and did not end until 5 in the morning. His biological clock disappeared. Normal rest became impossible. The work began when most people were preparing to go to sleep and ended when the sun was already beginning to rise. And all of that was still only preparation for the most difficult moment of all. When filming of The Passion began, everything changed. On the first or second day, while running across the sand dunes, Roumie suffered a violent fall. His foot became trapped, his body lost its balance, and he fell head first. The result was a separation of the acromioclavicular joint in his right shoulder. Perhaps the cruelest detail was that this was the very shoulder on which, in the weeks that followed, he would have to carry the heavy wooden crossbeam. It was almost as if his own body had received a warning before the main scene had even begun. And that would not be his only injury. On another occasion, he struck his head against a wooden board and spent months dealing with cervical spine issues. The scourging scenes were performed using foam whips, but that did not mean they were comfortable. After approximately 10 hours of filming, the marks remained on his body. And then there was another requirement. Jesus' body needed to look like the body of a man who had endured extreme suffering. Roumie lost a significant amount of weight for the crucifixion scenes, dropping to around 70 kilograms, an extremely low weight for someone of his height. In Utah, during certain takes, he even experienced heart palpitations that he could not explain. Later medical examinations confirmed that his heart was healthy. But the question remained, how much of that exhaustion came simply from the physical strain, and how much came from the intensity of spending so many hours in that physical and emotional state? Because there is an enormous difference between portraying a person who is suffering and spending hours inside a situation designed to recreate, within the limits of a film production, what that person would have endured. An actor can portray an emotion, and when the director yells, "Cut," he can step away from the scene. But what happens when the character demands such a profound level of surrender that the actor himself begins carrying some of that emotion beyond the frame? That was when Roumie used an expression that helps explain what happened: a merging of souls. The idea was not simply to imitate Jesus. It was to allow the psychological barriers between actor and character to become smaller and smaller, especially during the most painful part of Christ's life. Roumie described this process as opening himself so that Christ could work through him during the portrayal. And there is an inevitable consequence to making that choice. When someone decides to immerse himself in an experience of that magnitude, something remains. An experience built around pain, abandonment, violence, and death does not automatically disappear when the costume comes off. And perhaps the production unintentionally found a way to make that experience even more real. During approximately 3.5 weeks of filming The Passion, Roumie was separated from the actors who portrayed the disciples. Those men who normally were part of his daily life on set were no longer around him. Instead, he was surrounded by soldiers, Pharisees, and an environment designed to convey hostility. The man tasked with portraying Jesus walked through that environment almost entirely alone, and that created a strange situation. The very structure of the production began, unintentionally, to recreate one of the central elements of the story they were telling: loneliness, abandonment, isolation, desolation. Jesus walked toward the cross knowing that those closest to him had disappeared from his side. And while Roumie had to portray that reality in front of the cameras, he was also spending weeks away from the group with whom he normally shared his work. The difference was that, for him, it did not necessarily end when the director called cut. The impact began to affect more than just the lead actor. At one point, one of the Italian extras playing a Roman soldier had to punch Roumie in the stomach. It was a rehearsed action. There was a script. There was choreography. There was padding. And there were techniques designed to make everything safe. But after the scene, the man approached Roumie, weeping uncontrollably and apologizing for what he had just done. He knew it was only a film shoot. He knew the actor was not actually Jesus, and yet, something about that experience had crossed the barrier between the character and the person. That kind of reaction appeared in other ways as well. During scenes such as the Last Supper and Calvary, members of the cast and crew could be seen wiping tears from their eyes. The atmosphere became so emotionally heavy that, in Roumie's words, it felt as though no one was simply pretending anymore. Everyone, in some way, was participating in that experience of the Passion. And perhaps that is one of the most difficult things to understand when we think about religious filmmaking. We see the finished result. We see a few carefully edited minutes. We see an image, a line, a tear, a blow, a cross. But we do not see the 10 hours that came before. We do not see the dozens of repetitions. We do not see the body waiting while the lighting and cameras are adjusted. We do not see the actor returning to the same position after a break. We do not see the effort required to repeat an expression of pain when the body is already exhausted. We do not see what happens after a take ends. And that is precisely where the true weight of that crucifixion begins to emerge. Because Roumie was not simply tired. He was physically injured, emotionally exhausted, and spiritually affected by what he was trying to portray. And there was another dimension that made everything even more personal. He already carried within himself his own experiences of suffering. Long before he became the face of Jesus for millions of people, Roumie had endured painful experiences during childhood, including bullying. Years later, looking back on those experiences, he began to see those wounds differently. Within his spiritual understanding, that suffering could also be offered up. It did not have to remain only as the memory of something that had hurt him. It could be placed before God as an offering for people who were suffering. That helps explain a prayer he made before filming began. He asked to experience just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of Christ's suffering. He was not asking to feel the full pain of the crucifixion. I was asking for a small participation in what he was about to portray. And then came the part that probably no one could have planned. The shoulder injury happened near the very beginning. The cervical problems remained. The long hours of scourging scenes left marks on his body. His body was pushed to an extreme level of exhaustion. And Roumie began to interpret all of this through the lens of his own faith. For him, those pains could be offered up, together with the older wounds from his own life for people who needed prayer. But if his body was carrying the consequences, the soul would carry them too. After filming the crucifixion scenes ended, Roumie realized that he could not simply return to normal life. He described what he experienced as a kind of artistic post-traumatic stress disorder. It was not merely sadness. It was not simply exhaustion after a difficult job. It was a reaction that continued to surface in completely different situations. One of the most striking examples happened during Mass. When the moment came for the elevation of the Eucharist, Roumie would begin to cry uncontrollably. The liturgy, which normally would be a moment of prayer and contemplation, had become connected in his memory to what he had just portrayed. The image of the Eucharist was no longer separate from his experience of the cross. The experience of the crucifixion had become so emotionally profound that those two worlds began to touch within him. And perhaps this is where the story stops being only about the weight of filming a difficult scene and becomes a story about the cost of trying to portray a sacred reality. Because it is one thing to portray Jesus in front of a camera. It is another thing to spend months entering into his story day after day, reconstructing his final moments, repeating the violence, the abandonment, the pain, and the death, until your own body begins to respond as though the experience has left behind a physical memory. Roumie needed to step away for a week, spending time in silence and isolation at a monastery in the desert to try to process everything he had experienced. The man who had spent weeks surrounded by hundreds of people now needed silence. After portraying the loneliness of Christ, he needed to be alone to discover how to become Jonathan again. But there is an even greater irony in this story. Roumie's relationship with the cross did not begin with The Chosen. Decades earlier, when he was only 12 years old, he had been deeply affected by Franco Zeffirelli's miniseries Jesus of Nazareth. And then he did something his parents did not even know about. He found some wooden boards and built a cross by himself in the backyard. He placed nails where the hands and feet would have been. He made a crown of thorns from branches. And beside the garage, he reenacted the Stations of the Cross and the crucifixion itself. Years later, as an adult, when that memory returned to him in 2016, the coincidence took on an entirely different meaning. The boy who had built a cross without knowing where that image would one day lead him had become the man who would now have to stand before a real cross, surrounded by cameras, crew members, extras, and millions of viewers who would one day watch his portrayal. Perhaps the most remarkable part is not the coincidence itself. Perhaps it is realizing that, from Roumie's perspective, the story seemed to have begun long before he understood what was happening. In 2018, when his professional and financial life had completely fallen apart, he found himself broke, in debt, and without food. That was when he knelt before a crucifix in his apartment and surrendered to God control over his life and his career. Hours later, he received 4 checks in the mail that together totaled $1,100. Months later, he would be cast to portray Jesus. The same man who had once knelt before a crucifix asking for help would eventually, years later, be placed on a cross in front of cameras to portray Christ himself. And that is precisely why the crucifixion in The Chosen can be understood as much more than a sequence of difficult scenes. It seems to represent the point where several stories come together. The boy who built a cross in his backyard, the actor who surrendered his career to God, the man who endured exhaustion and injuries, the character who had to experience abandonment, and the person who, after filming ended, discovered that he could not simply leave that cross behind. But there is still one final layer. During preparations for Season 6, some viewers expressed concern about watching it. They said it would be too painful, that it would be difficult to endure watching the crucifixion, that perhaps they would rather stay with the gentler parts of Jesus' story. And it was precisely in response to that reaction that Roumie expressed one of the most powerful ideas to emerge from this entire experience. Do not run from the cross, because there is a very human temptation to want only the Jesus of the miracles, the Jesus who turns water into wine, the Jesus who heals, the Jesus who feeds the multitudes, the Jesus who speaks words capable of bringing hope. But when the story reaches the moment when the suffering begins, when the crowds disappear, when his friends run away, and when the cross appears on the horizon, there is a tendency to want to look away. But the Christian story does not end with the miracles. It passes through the cross. And perhaps that is precisely what made Jonathan Roumie's work so demanding. He was not simply portraying the most painful part of Jesus' story for a camera. I was entering the moment when the Christian narrative demands that the viewer stop looking for an easy way out. The production could build a wooden cross. It could recreate the desert. It could provide the soldiers. It could create the makeup, the effects, the whips, and the wounds. But it could not manufacture what would happen inside the people who were there. The Roman soldier who cried after striking Jesus. The crew members wiping tears from their eyes. The actor who remained isolated for weeks. The injured body carrying the crossbeam, the old wounds being placed before God, and then, afterward, a man walking into Mass and discovering that he could no longer look at the Eucharist without remembering what he had just portrayed. It is at this point that the question is no longer, how much suffering did Jonathan Roumie endure to film the crucifixion? The question becomes, what happens to a person when he spends too much time looking at the cross? Perhaps that is the reason this production left such deep marks. Because the crucifixion is not a scene that can simply be fully understood through technique alone. You can control the camera, You can control the lighting, you can control the makeup, you can control the set, you can repeat a take as many times as necessary, but you cannot completely control what an image like that awakens in the people standing before it. And perhaps that is exactly why the weight of filming the crucifixion in The Chosen was not simply in the wood being carried, the injuries, the hours of filming, or the physical exhaustion. The true weight was in remaining before the cross long enough for it to stop being merely a scene. For Jonathan Roumie, apparently, that is what happened. The camera finally stopped, the lights were turned off, the costume was removed, the crew went home, but the cross remained. It remained in his injured body. It remained in his tears. It remained during Mass. It remained in the memory of that 12-year-old boy building a cross alone in his backyard. And above all, it remained in the question that the Passion itself places before anyone willing to look at it without turning away. If Christ did not run from the cross, why should we run from it? Perhaps watching the crucifixion in The Chosen will be difficult precisely because the production is not trying to make Calvary comfortable. And perhaps that is the point. Because after following Jesus through the miracles, the crowds, the healings, and the words that comfortable. And perhaps that is the point. Because after following Jesus through the miracles, the crowds, the healings, and the words that changed lives, there comes a moment when we can no longer remain merely spectators. The time comes to look at the cross and remain. If this story we'll see you in the next video.